I'd like to introduce to you Peter Weiss and who are with us tonight for our first in the series of U.S. Crimes Against International Law. This event is titled The Framework of International Law, History, Mechanisms, and Enforcement. Peter Weiss is a retired international and intellectual property lawyer, currently working on 3 projects that he thinks are unlikely to be completed in his lifetime, but who knows. The elimination of torture, the abolition of nuclear weapons, and peace and justice for Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East. He is president of the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, vice president of the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms, and vice president of the Center for Constitutional Rights. We are honored to have him with us tonight, so please help me give a warm welcome to Peter Weiss.
I thought I would inaugurate this very welcome series by going back a while in history. But before I do that, let me start with the good news and the bad news. The good news is that this morning I got an email from Europe saying that the European Union had allocated 4 million euros for a project to train judiciaries how to handle war crimes cases. Can you imagine that happening here? I can't.
How much is that in US dollars?
Pardon?
Is it 125 US to €1?
It's a lot of money.
It's more than, it's about $5 million.
Yep.
The bad news is that the Second Circuit last week came down with a really abominable decision in a case called Cobile, in which they decided 2-1 with a very strong dissent by Judge Laval that corporations could not be sued for human rights violations. So right now the law in the Second Circuit is you can sue corporations for product liability cases and any number of other things, but you can't sue them if they are complicit in rape and other gross human rights violations. Now, 2 books have recently come out taking opposite positions on the history of human rights. One, I don't have their first names, by somebody named Just, tracing the history of human rights all the way back to the Bible and beyond. And the other one by somebody named Moyne, who said that human rights is a very recent invention. It really started with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter would probably accept that accolade, and he deserves it because he was the only president who he was the first president to appoint an Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and made human rights an essential part of American policy. And incidentally, Obama, you know, like most of you, I worked for him, I voted for him, and like most of you, I have rather strong criticisms of many aspects of the current policy. But I was very pleased to hear that at his speech at the UN the other day, he mentioned human rights, I think, for the first time. Not only that, but he even mentioned that rape is a war crime, which is a position that was sponsored and really lobbied for throughout the world by my colleague Rhonda Copeland from the Center for Constitutional Rights, who regretfully died this summer. So, okay, so let me go back. It's fairly easy for me to do that because back in 2004, I gave a formal lecture, not like this one, which would be very informal, at my alma mater, St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, which I called Human Rights from Antigone to Rosa Parks. And I began with the famous passage in Sophocles where Antigone is trying to bury her brother Polynices, who had attacked Thebes, and Creon, the king or governor or mayor, whatever you want to call him, of Thebes, said because he had attacked Thebes, he couldn't be buried. And she said, "Fuck you. I'm going to bury him because the law doesn't come from you. It comes from divine inspiration." And I think that was, if not the first, certainly one of the first dramatic examples of a woman using human rights to accomplish an important objective. And I compared that with Rosa Parks, because what is, I think, not very generally known is that she wasn't actually asked to go to the back of the bus. You know, she sat in the back of the bus, and a white man wanted her seat, and the driver told her to get up, and she wouldn't get up. And when she was asked why she did that, which was unheard of at the time where it was happening, she said, "I just don't like the way we were treated, and I'm tired of it." So being tired of it and getting a command from heaven are things that are really not antithetical, because the command from heaven, in Antigone's case, gave her the authority to do what she felt was wrong. So I then read a little Plato, and I read a little Aristotle, and I like this passage from Aristotle because we'll be talking about something called universal jurisdiction, and people think that was just invented 5 or 6 years ago. But this is what Aristotle said about it. He said, particular law is that which each community lays down and applies to its own members. This is partly written and partly unwritten. Written law, customary. Universal law is the law of nature. And I like this passage. He says, for there really is, as everyone to some extent divines, a natural justice and injustice that is binding on all men, even on those who have no association or covenant with each other. I should say, I forgot to mention this, but I'll mention it now. Between the two women, between Antigone and Rosa Parks, there was another woman that I had never heard of until I did a fair amount of research for this lecture. And she was the daughter of a butcher in France. And her name was Olympe de Gouges. And in 1790, she published her own version of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is written by a bunch of men. And at the end of her revised version, she said, "Woman, wake up. The tocsin of reason is being heard throughout the whole universe. Discover your rights." And what did she get for that? She got the guillotine. So women have played a very important part in the development of human rights law. I'm going to jump forward rather drastically because human rights in the modern era go back at least as far as John Locke, one of the inspirations for the Declaration of Independence. What I didn't know until I did this research is that he was also a precursor of Marx. Here's his version of from each according to his ability to each according to need. This is the way John Locke put it. He said, "As much as anyone can make use of to any advantage of life before it spoils, so much he may by his labor fix a property in. Whatever is beyond this is more than his share and belongs to others." Now you know where Carl got it. Excuse me just a second. So then we come to the Universal Declaration of Rights and Eleanor Roosevelt. I think Jean will have something to say about that. And I want to just go for a minute from human rights, which is what I've been talking about so far. And you can see which of those two authors I am on the side of. I mean, the guy who wrote about the novelty of human rights just didn't understand that it was a semantic thing. I mean, rights have been talked about and fought over for as long as people could think. But international law is, of course, much vaster a field than just human rights. But I want to tell you that international law, which is so disrespected these days by our government, is really, in many ways, that is modern international law, a creation of Americans. When you go to the Netherlands, to The Hague, to the Peace Palace, and look at the street sign in front of the Peace Palace, it says Carnegieplein, Carnegie Place, because Andrew Carnegie paid for the Peace Palace in which the International Court of Justice now sits. And Elihu Root, who was a Republican Secretary of State was one of the founders of the American Society of International Law. He was a great believer in international law. And I think both in his case and Andrew Carnegie's case, they talked about the need for international law in terms of ideals, but they were really thinking of their commercial interests. Elliot Root was a corporation lawyer, but he was very active in the promotion of international law. So it's sad in many ways that today international law is being dissed by this government and by many judges. I mentioned one case before that was just decided here in the Second Circuit. There was another case the week before in Washington, where the entire court en banc held by a majority, again with some strong dissenting voices, that whether Guantanamo detainees had a right of habeas corpus was strictly a matter of domestic law and was not to be interpreted according to any of the rules of international law. Really a preposterous position, which I think will find very little echo outside of the borders of the United States. But there is in international law now a kind of duality, a twofold duality. On the one hand, you have to recognize that the period since the end of World War II, beginning with Nuremberg, which again Jeannie will speak about, has created a vast new arsenal of international law norms, some of which are what we call customary law because they're not written down, but many of which are in treaties, hundreds of treaties in the last 60 years or so. And on the other hand, as I've just demonstrated by the two examples I've given you, the implementation of those norms has gone backwards. So you have the norms being created, and the implementation going back. And for the students here, I would say it's your job to see to it that we go back in your lifetime and in your practice to the implementation. Another duality which came out at the last meeting of the American Society of International Law in April of this year was that on the one hand, international law is becoming very specialized and segmented. And on the other hand, there are certain norms that transcend all of these specializations, and you have two camps in international law now. You know, one says, let's develop commercial law, let's develop environmental law, and the other camp saying, yes, but let us do all that in recognition of the confirmation of certain fundamental norms. It gets a little complicated. So let me just tell you, again, I think for the students, I don't see too many, but there are some, how international law can impact your practice. In 1968, I was at a meeting at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and we had invited a then largely unknown young journalist named Seymour Hersh to come and talk to us about his first book, which was about chemical weapons. And at 6 o'clock, he looked at his watch and he said, "I gotta go." I said, "Where are you going?" "I gotta catch a plane to Atlanta and go to Fort Benning." "What are you gonna do in Fort Benning?" "I'm looking for the guy who committed the biggest massacre of the Vietnam War." So as I went down, I've stayed in touch with him since then. And he told me that when he got to Fort Benning and asked for Lieutenant Calley, it was like, who? We don't know from Lieutenant Calley. But he's a very persistent guy, so he hung around for a couple of days. And on the third day, a soldier came up to him and said in his ear, he said, "You're looking for Calley?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "He's sitting over there in the corner in the officers' mess having a beer." I said, "Thank you." That was the beginning of his Pulitzer Prize winning book about My Lai. And as a result of My Lai, we at the center started doing research about how we could get those responsible, not necessarily just Calley, but the people who formulated the policy that led Calley and his unit to do what they did. And it was then that we discovered something called the Alien Tort Claims Act, which is a law going back to the first Judiciary Act of this country, 1789, a one-sentence law that says that an alien shall have a right of action for a tort in violation of the law of nations, which is what we now call international law. And we actually got ready to bring that case. But eventually the Vietnamese decided that they didn't want to be in an American court in the middle of the war, so it was never brought at that time. But then 10 years later, I was sitting at my intellectual property law office and I got a call from Amnesty, from Gerhard Elston, who was in charge of Amnesty at the time, and he said there is a Paraguayan torturer sitting in the Immigration and Naturalization Service facility in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and he's about to be deported, and you gotta keep him, what? Okay, you gotta keep him here and sue him because he's a torturer. He tortured to death the son of an opponent of General Stroessner, the fascist president of Paraguay. And I said, "How are we going to do that?" And he said, "That's your problem." So we called an emergency meeting and we filed the first modern Alien Tort Claims Act case, which we won. And since then there have been hundreds of cases, and they have developed international law as applied to situations like this. And it's a good example of the unpredictability of the development of the law, because we really didn't think it was going to be such a big deal when we started. But the Alien Tort Claims Act has now been affirmed by the Supreme Court, and it's part of American jurisprudence. Let me just say very quickly, one of the areas that I've been very active in has to do with nuclear weapons. I work with some colleagues to bring a case to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and we eventually got a ruling saying that the use of threat and use of nuclear weapons is illegal, is generally illegal, and also they volunteered to say, because we hadn't asked them to do that there's a general obligation on the part of all countries in the world to get rid of their nuclear weapons. So that was a great organizing tool for a while, but then the whole thing died. Then Obama revived it with his Prague speech, in which he said that he was looking forward to a nuclear weapons-free world. And again, that became a big organizing tool to revive the anti-nuclear weapons movement throughout the world. But I've got to end, good note, I've got to end on a bad note again. About 2 or 3 months ago, Hillary Clinton made a speech in the State Department to the staffers who had worked on the New START agreement with Russia. And she congratulated them for their hard work. And at the end she said, "And you have done something that will eventually," she didn't say eventually, "that may bring about the nuclear weapons-free world that the president talked about in some century," she said. I hate to leave you with that note.